countries around the world, different cultures around the world, how they've used plants well in advance of what we've done here in the United States. And so now we're progressing through time. So what happens is after we talk about the Renaissance, the doctrine of signatures, all those good things, by the time we hit the 18th century, this is when people start to talk about this as modern times. So as science as a discipline progressed, what happened was medicine started to diverge from just being a lot of just using herbal treatments, using plants, to actually, I don't want to say more scientific, because it is scientific, but this schism, this dichotomy, this split occurred where you started to have someone who was either a medical doctor or they were a herbal physician. And sort of what comes to play here is you got to remember back in the 15, 16, 1700s, if you were to become a medical doctor, you had to take classes in botany. You had to be able to identify those plants around your patients where you might have to go and collect some plant parts and make a tea or something like that. Around the 18th century, the late 1700s, we're talking about, that started to change a little bit. We had a lot of really great scientific discoveries, such that by the 19th century, scientists were still working with plants, but they started to purify extracts of the plants. So rather than to give your patient a particular plant in a tea or something, they would distill out, we'll talk about this on Monday, how they would do this, but you could take the biochemical compounds of the plant, and at the time they had no clue what those were, they just knew that something worked, and you could distill it out and add it to all sorts of things. For example, they would add it a lot to wine and alcohol in some cases. So in 1806, that was a big breakthrough point where this researcher, you don't need to really know his name, but just remember that around 1806, at that time period, the first big shift was that people were able to isolate morphine from opium poppy. So now at that point, they actually could identify what they were pulling out. And here's Frederick. And again, you don't need to know his name, but I just want you to focus on, it was morphine from opium poppy that was really the first compound that scientists were able to pull out from the plant in the laboratory. Furthermore, they were able to determine the structure of it, which is cool, because what that means is if you can get the structure, in some cases you can then replicate that in the lab. Not always. We'll talk about that in just a moment. So in the middle of the 19th century, so mid-1800s, so I always like to compare like what was going on then here in the United States. That's going to be the Civil War was going on at that time period. So this is when the first synthetic drugs were able to be developed in the lab. So researchers were like, this is great. We don't have to go to the plant all the time. We can just make it up in the lab because we know what it is. In the 19th century, there was also what's known as eclectic medicine. And eclectic medicine was this idea that medical plants were still important. So it's still plant-based, but the idea was that you needed to extract out the components of those plants, and then you could give those to patients. So we're going to be talking a bit off and on during the semester about the Lloyd brothers. This is a Cincinnati connection. There were three brothers, the Lloyd brothers, and they actually made a whole bunch of money back in the day because John Uri Lloyd, actually, I think he was the pharmacist. There were other ones, Curtis Gates was the botanist, and the other one was sort of like the business manager. Anyways, they made tons of money. Like in today's world, they would probably be like billionaires. So John Uri Lloyd actually invented a method to extract and to get the compounds, obtain the compounds from medicinal plants. And you can see he has this whole setup. Today there's the Lloyd Library in downtown, and you can go there and you can see a lot of this apparatus still there. They also, because they had so much money, they could buy anything they want. So they bought a lot of really important botanical texts from all around the world. So some of these textbooks that we talked about the other day, these beautiful herbals from the Renaissance and so forth, a few of those actually are at the Lloyd Library here in Cincinnati. So, okay, established the Lloyd Library and Lloyd Library and Museum. Okay, so moving now in time period to the 20th century, this is where there was, again, another big shift where there was a greater reliance on synthetic drugs. And so scientists and medical professionals honestly started to like ignore the plants, be like, hey, we can make up whatever we want in the laboratory. We are good to go. So plants were no longer a source for new medicines. They were like, you know, we can get it originally from the plant, and then in the lab, we can start to tinker with it, change its functional groups. We'll talk all about this next week. But we could do it ourselves. But that changed when penicillin came along, because people oftentimes were just dying of normal diseases, and penicillin was really a groundbreaker in the sense that it was something that, I mean, today we don't think about this because we can easily get penicillin, amoxicillin, all these different things. If you're sick, if you have a bacterial infection, you go to the doctor and they say, oh, here's your penicillin. But back then they didn't have any. So people were just dying of simple things. But that really changed. So the other thing that started to come about in the 20th century is the development of alternative medicine. And we talked a little bit about this the other day. But essentially there's what's known as alternative and complementary. And so this is important. Sometimes when I teach this class, I get sometimes people who just think it's all about herbal alternative medicine, and you've probably already gotten the sense that it's not. Essentially, we're going to be talking a lot about complementary medicine using plants. But alternative is where you use something else in place of conventional medicine. So think in here, you know, my uncle once, when he was alive, unfortunately he died of cancer a few years ago, but when cancer was diagnosed, he read on the internet that you don't do anything, you shouldn't go through any treatment that's damaging, you should eat wheatgrass. And so some lady was selling wheatgrass, and so he was just eating wheatgrass like crazy, and his cancer got worse. And unfortunately, by the time he realized wheatgrass wasn't working and the family was finally able to get through to him, like, you need to go see a doctor, the cancer was too extensive, and so he passed away. There's been a lot of cases in the news about different cultures, like in the Amish here in Ohio. They have a whole system where it's very unlikely, if ever, they're going to end up in a Western medicine, doctor's office. And so you can have lots of interesting conversations and ethical arguments about alternative medicine. So we're going to be focusing more on complementary medicine, where you use this other medical approach together with complementary medicine. So I think we talked the other day about all different types of things, but music even, or aromatherapy to lessen discomfort. I went through a surgery once, and the doctors beforehand said, bring your CDs. And I'm like, what? And they're like, no, seriously, bring what music you like, your CDs, and we'll play it during the surgery. And I'm like, well, I'm going to be out. And they're like, it doesn't matter. Sometimes we find it's helpful. So then my response was, what do you guys like? Because you're doing the surgery. And so, yeah. Okay, so just briefly again, alternative medicines are complete systems of theory and practice, oftentimes from other cultures or other non-normal, like Western medicine perspectives. So that's one approach. Mind-body interventions. This seems a little bit strange to us maybe here, at least it did to me initially, but there's a lot of evidence that shows that our mind's capacity has the ability to influence how our body reacts and how it heals. So there's some techniques that are mainstream. I mentioned the other day, prayer is really important, patient support groups, mental healing, creative therapies. And then this is cut off. There's biologically based therapies using herbs, and so that's one of the things that we'll be talking about too. Another thing, which I think is probably cut off, okay, that's using 40% of Americans use some form of CAM, complementary and alternative medicine, and we already talked about prayer. What's cut off there, I think, it's cut off for some weird reason. But there's also approaches such as, they probably go a little bit more the mind-body, but energy-focused approaches. And so in the past, I thought this was sort of crazy. But there's these alternative approaches, the energy, also touch. But in other cultures, so one of my students, she actually was over in Belarus years ago before there were problems over there. And she apprenticed to a wise woman there. She actually was originally from Belarus and she went back, and they used energy therapy. So if you were sick, you would lie down, and then in this case, the wise woman, the doctor, would come up and just hold her hands like just above you and feel, and try to diagnose what was wrong. And so my student actually had a yeast infection while she was there. The doctors couldn't figure it out. She's like, okay, I'll go to the wise woman. And the wise woman figured out what it was and gave her a vaginal suppository made of herbs, and it cleared it right up. So anyway, that's that. The other thing with touch, it's really important, and we recognize that now in the United States. When women, like when I had my daughter, one of the first things they do is baby comes out, they're trying to clean up the baby. And then what they do is they ask the mother to actually pull open, her gown if it's open, and they lay the baby right on the chest. Because they say that skin-to-skin contact is so important. If the mom's not available, they also do this with the father, if the father's there, or the other parent who might be there. So that's what they do. So pretty cool. Okay, so moving forward to the 21st century. We're now at a point where, if you guys follow the news, we have a lot of drug resistance going on. And so now what's happening is science, I would argue, is starting to shift a little bit more, and it's reaching out to try new sources to treat these new diseases. So now plants are being targeted again. In fact, a lot of the drug companies actually have ethnobotanical experts. They will hire people to actually travel around the world, interact with different cultures, try to figure out what plants might be important, bring them back to the lab, and then they test them. So that's one thing. And so again, we have AIDS, AIDS, we're getting better at it. We'll talk about that later on. Cancer, malaria, dementia, a lot of these different things that are so important that we need to be developing new treatments for. So for the 21st century, the important thing here is that some compounds are still derived from plants today. I told you we can make some in the lab, but there's two reasons why they're still derived from plants. One, they just can't be synthesized. So what it is there is that they're just too complicated. So digitalis and Taxol. Taxol is from this plant over here. It's a Pacific yew, Y-E-W. We're talking a lot about that. Those is the chemical structure is just way too complicated to make in the lab. It's going to cost too much money. And so that's the second reason, is it's just too expensive. So things like atropine, morphine, reserpine, oftentimes they won't start from the very beginning. They'll try to get a compound from the plant, and then they might modify it a little bit in the lab, but usually that's what works. So the point is that we've gone through history where plants were the premier and sole use, I would argue, one of the most important ways to treat medical conditions, sort of fell out of favor over time. And now we're seeing this resurgence, I would argue, of people are going back to plants to try to figure out what are some other compounds that we might be able to harness. Remember, I told you about how plants are little chemical factories. So essentially, the point is that plants and their derived chemicals, as I just said, have been around a long time. We talked about 80% of the world's population still uses non-Western approaches, and so much of that does still involve herbal remedies. And plant compounds are still very, very much important in Western medicine. So that's the important part from the other day. Now what we're going to do is we're going to shift over to plant morphology and taxonomy. And this is usually, this is my show and tell, as I mentioned earlier. Before we start talking a lot about these different chemical compounds and what they do to the body, we need to have a really good understanding of where you find them. So we have to talk about plant morphology, but it's much more than just leaves, flowers, roots. We're going to get into a little bit more detail about that. And then taxonomy, we're just going to go over some of the plant families that are more common. And if you don't get it right away, you'll get it, because we'll be talking about these families over and over again. But this is sort of the intro to that. So, plant plant morphology, of course, is really important to know because the different parts of a plant can have different amounts of a compound. They can have different compounds. You might have something in the leaves that might be different from what's in the roots. So they're going to have quite different active ingredients. Now, of course, this is going to depend upon what species of plant you're looking at. And because some species that are related to each other, some might have an active ingredient and the other one doesn't. But also, if you're just focusing on the compound itself, we'll talk about stories later on this semester where scientists found this, like a cancer-fighting compound in one plant. They used it all up. They went back to the same plant. They found out for the same area, same forest. They found out someone had chopped down the tree. So then they had to search around and try to find another tree, and they couldn't find anything. They finally did eventually. Okay, so what we're going to do is go through the different structures. And as we do this, I'm going to try to remember to send around some little examples for you guys to look at. So we're going to start at the bottom of the plant. So everyone hopefully should know that plants have roots. In general, most of them, some don't. There are some aerial plants, but for medicinal purposes, most of the plants we're talking about have roots. So that's just the underground portion that provides and stores water and nutrients to the underground, to the above ground shoots. So it's just taking in water, usually some nutrients, shuttling it up through the vascular system to the top of the plant. The top of the plant, of course, is photosynthesizing, and that's going to be shuttling sugars down to the roots. So that's how the plant grows. So taproot, right? Carrot? Pass around the carrot. I don't know if anyone wants to see a carrot. Carrot. No one sees, okay. Everybody carrot. Oh, come on. That's just a big carrot. I went to the store and I was literally trying to find the biggest carrot I could find, and the guy next to me was like, "What are you doing?" And I had to explain that I was trying to find a big carrot. The other day I was buying Christmas presents, and I was at this one garden store, and the guy looked at me funny, and he says, "I was in your class years ago." It's always happens. All right, so next, if we think about a bulb could be a tulip, a daffodil, even an onion is a bulb. And if you've ever wondered what is a bulb, all it is a compressed stem with thickened leaves. So if you look at the bulb at the very bottom, usually there's little roots that come out if you plant them. So this is not a root. What it is if you take a long plant and you just squeeze it down, compress it down, that's what's going on here. So these fleshy parts, if you have a onion and you peel it apart, so essentially those are the thickened leaves that you're pulling off. Now, of course, it's going to grow up, and you're going to have a slender shoot that goes up eventually. But that's what it's all about. Now, if you do cooking like me and you go to the store, I forgot to grab a ginger. I love ginger. Ginger is a rhizome. A rhizome is a stem that's laying on top of the ground. So it's a horizontal, well, here it says underground. It could be underground, but it doesn't grow downwards. It's going to go horizontally. Oftentimes it is maybe just underground or sometimes along the surface. So irises are this way, all sorts of things like that. So that's that. Now, oh, here we go. My very big potato. I should have been thinking about getting smaller potatoes. Okay, so a potato is not a root. It is not a bulb or rhizome. It is a tuber. So if you ever plant a potato, it does have roots. If you ever do the thing where have roots and shoots. But the cool thing about this is the tuber has no basal plate. In other words, there's no up and down. So you can just stick this way in a glass of water and it'll grow roots and shoots, or you can do it this way and it'll grow roots and shoots. If you try to do that with a bulb, people oftentimes don't know which way they plant it. They plant it upside down. And the bulb sometimes will grow, just be like, it only goes out one side. So the tuber essentially is a thickened stem, and it doesn't have any predetermined growth pattern. There's no growth basal plate. So I don't know if Teddy knows that. Mason's looking at it. He wants that potato. Okay, another one I didn't bring is a corn. A corm is like a bowl, like a gladiola, if you've ever grown gladiolus, where it looks like a bowl. But again, this is just another underground thing, right? But it's a thickened stem, and this one does have a basal surface. So the corm, if you, crocus does this too, by the way. If you plant a corm the wrong way, again, you'll either die, or the roots will be like growing this way, and the stem will be like trying to go that way, and it's all convoluted. So that's what we have. All right. We're going to be talking about some plant compounds, like Taxol, that actually are derived from the bark of a tree. So what the heck is bark? Bark are essentially just the protective layers of a tree. And if you guys you remember back to your basic biology classes, if you've taken that, hopefully you remember there's the vascular system, and as the tree undergoes, or the plant undergoes secondary growth, it starts to get additional layers around there. But you still have the cambial cell layer that has your xylem and your phloem there, but you have the outer parts of the bark that's protecting it. So the bark is really important there too. Leaves, that's easy. Leaves are the primary site of photosynthesis. Shown here is ginkgo. We're going to be talking about ginkgo in just a little bit. It's considered to be one of the oldest plant species. It's the fossilized examples of ginkgo from the past. And so those are the above ground structures of the bark and the leaf. Okay, let's move to flowers. This is the fun time. So the flowers are the reproductive structure. So what I want you guys to do is we're going to pass around my cheap, inexpensive flowers. And so if you want to participate, feel free to pull off a flower or two of what you want. So hand those out.
Oh, pretty.
There you go. And let me grab a pink one because it's pink. There we go. So one thing I want you to look at is, well, first of all, we're getting to this, but I'll just tell you, I'll give it away. This is not one flower. This is actually a collection of flowers. So whenever we see a daisy or something in the aster family, people just assume it's one flower. It's not. You can actually pull this apart, and you see all these little tiny florets. So there are essentially, I don't know, hundreds of things in here. And if you can think of a sunflower, each one becomes a sunflower seed, right? So the cool thing about these is in the middle, each floret is hermaphroditic, so it has both male and female function. The petals are also individual flowers. These ones are always female. So if you look closely, you can see like the little style poking up out of that. So anyways, they're sort of neat. What we have here is, so an inflorescence is a collection of flowers. So technically, again, those flowers, I'm using the word flower, they're not flowers, they're inflorescences. And this is another example of that. The other things that are inflorescences are dandelions, those flowers. But here you can sort of see these are all individual little flowers, and this is the disc flower and the ray flower. So pretty darn cool, right? Okay, so this is what we're looking at with flowers. We have, oh, and I should send around, I have this here. So I told you the other day about cloves. So here's cloves. I'm trying to make it so you guys don't have to like touch the whole plant, but now you're touching the whole. That was very effective. But those are cloves. So there. You can smell them a little bit too.
Really pretty little orange.
So cloves, what we have there, this is actually the cloves. They're actually little buds that develop. So those are collected before they're able to become a flower. So that's a case of buds of the flowers being used. Okay, again, here's the structure of the flower. This should be all reviewed. The most obvious is the petal. We have the sepals down at the base, the receptacle, which holds essentially the ovule.
Yeah, it's clove. It smells like.
It has the ovules in it. Usually you have your stigma there. And what? We have your stamens. So this is where the pollen's produced. So this is the male part. This is the female part.
I'm happy I even
So
vague
that's
a
what the
little bit
flowers
because
are.
I wouldn't have known.
Now it turns out that medicinally, in some plants, we might use the stigma for things. We might use the anthers for things. And you might not realize it. You might be more familiar with something and not realize it. So this middle part, of course, which is it's pollinated, it blows up and becomes a fruit. And then the ovules within those fruits then become the seeds. So here's again the same thing, just showing different parts of the flower. If you're like me, you like pictures. The ovary is hidden in here, we can't really see it. These are all the stamens, which have the pollen, the style, and the stigma, the female part. Okay, here's a cool thing. If you guys have ever had saffron chicken, or it's really good. You cook with saffron. If you've ever looked at it, saffron is really expensive in the store. Little tiny bottle, 10, 12 bucks. And it's
Just a few
because
strands.
saffron is actually the stigmas of the crocus. It's a crocus plant, and they actually collect these little stigmas. And that becomes this, right? And that is the saffron. And then the stamens of some plants, this is fennel. So if you ever cook with fennel, you're eating stamens. Another one, which I don't think is here. Oh, maybe I didn't have it. Does anyone know what's the longest stigmas of like a common type of plant that you might be really familiar with, but you don't realize it? It's corn.
Ah.
So if you ever eat corn and you have to pull off all that annoying tassels, so that's actually the stigmas of the corn. Okay, let's talk about fruits. There's different types of fruits. Fruits is a general term. So berries to me are the easiest to think about. A berry is a fleshy fruit containing many seeds. So I always think tomato, blueberry. It's a fleshy fruit. The other options, you'll see some of these are dry. So it's fleshy and it has many seeds. A drupe is something that's sort of interesting. A drupe is a fruit that, again, is fleshy, but it only has one seed. So an apricot is a good example. An avocado. I'm trying to think of what's in my kitchen. So a drupe just has one seed. A pome, P-O-M-E, is again a fleshy fruit, but this is where the fruit itself doesn't derive from the ovary, like I told you in that picture. The fruit actually comes from the receptacle underneath it. So what happens is, if you ever look at an apple, there's usually a stem, and that's where it attaches to the plant. And if you ever look at the other end of the apple, it's sort of like weird frilly stuff coming out. This is where the actual flower was. So when this apple was growing on the tree, it was actually 180 degrees up. It was growing up this way. But this is where the flower parts were. So oftentimes when we see this, little things down here, that might be the withered petals. Sometimes you can see anthers in there too, sort of cool. But the rest of this is the receptacle. We'll be talking out later about how apples and many other species, especially apricots, which have the drupe, they produce hydrogen and cyanide. And so you guys, if you eat those things like me and you love them, you're eating plants, and you swallow the seeds of the apples, which I cannot do. You're swallowing a little bit of hydrogen and cyanide. It's not a big deal unless you crush it, and that releases the cyanide. All right, so the other point here is capsules. So I was talking about how these are all fleshy.
Yep.
And you have some things like this. This is a
Also cherry
hibiscus
bits,
fruit,
too.
actually. And it's dry, it just pops open. Some of these have what's called ballistic seed
How have I
dispersal.
not
I used to
accidentally
work on
killed
violets,
myself?
and I would bring them indoors. We were trying to actually measure seed dispersal, and a little violet plant can actually shoot its seeds up to 12 feet away.
Yeah.
And they don't do it all at once. They just go, whee, whee. And I was literally teaching in Michigan in a classroom. We had a bunch of them in the back of the class, and every once in a while they start hitting the walls, and we just all start cracking up. but they can shoot pretty far. Okay, and then you have things that are complex. All right, so here is the pineapple. So a pineapple, if you look at this little sucker, this one is green, and it has, each of these were originally one flower. So they just all sort of combined together to be a fruit. So it's complex. I'll have to show you a picture of how they grow. So I do work in the Hawaiian Islands, and I used to grow them there a lot. For some reason, I always thought they grew on trees. I don't know why. They grow on a big plant, it looks like an yhgb, and then it sends up a stalk, and it just produces this on the top of the stalk. It's really funny looking. But anyways, I don't know. If you guys ever look closely to a pineapple, you can check that one out. All right, what do I have here? I forgot to give you my roots. So
Radish.
we have radishes. So, and they're falling. Toss everybody in there. Thank you.
Radish on the run.
So radishes, these are a great example of, well, let's think about this. What would it be? So the radish actually is the root that just got
look really
big.
similar.
So it's not, so the other thing you might say is, oh, maybe it's a compressed stem. Sometimes you have to see how these things grow to find out, and you monitor them over time, but this is a root. I don't know about you, but I love radishes, but not straight up. And then I brought broccoli. Broccoli, this might be a little bit more obvious to you. Broccoli is a whole bunch of buds, right? And broccoli, if you don't know it, is exactly the same species as cauliflower, Brussels sprouts.
Yeah, that's
a whole bunch of other
a
things.
turnip.
Are all the same. It's the same species. It's just different modified forms that humans have selected for over time. That's that. Oh, and then we have fun ones. I don't think we have
fun
here.
ones.
Oh, Brussels sprouts are the same as broccoli. And so this is how Brussels sprouts grow. The little
That
sprouts
is the
along the
weirdest
base
thing.
of the plant, and you pick them off. Oh, bananas. So bananas are really cool. Bananas is a fruit, and it's actually, what type of fruit do you think it would be? This is a weird one. It really stumps people. Any ideas? A what? A berry, you're right. It's a berry.
Yes.
So why is it a berry? Well, if you open it up,
Inside.
you see like little tiny aborted seeds. Honestly, it's really not even seeds at that point. They're off here.
I'm just
But
imagining the
if you
first
had a
person
real
who tried to eat
banana that hasn't
the
been modified
Brussels
by
sprout
humans,
I'm
this is
just
what they
thinking-
look like. This is more of a plantain.
If I was
And they have a whole bunch
them, I
of
would go
seeds.
like, that's a wizard staff there.
So one of the interesting
It's a plant
things
lizard.
is that bananas are actually going extinct.
That shit.
We have, in the past, there was something called the Big Mike was a banana that they sold all over the place. And it got hit by a bacterial infection, and it wiped out all the plantations primarily in South America. And then because of the Big Mike, that one's gone. Then they developed another cultivar known as the Cavendish. And that one now is being hit by the exact same bacteria. I think it's bacteria, not fungus. And now all of the plantations are starting to die back from that one. So who knows what's going to happen. If you want to know what Big Mike tastes like, buy Laffy Taffy banana. So if you do Laffy Taffy banana, like I guess at Jungle Gems, the taste is very, very sweet. It's very different from our current bananas because that's Big Mike. So,
All right,
all
I
right,
need to
here's
compare.
raspberries.
I like bananas.
What do you think are raspberries? Or blackberries, I should say. I'm not like I mean blackberries.
Good.
Are they complex?
They're called aggregate. That's tricky. But yeah, some people say it's complex, but it's primarily aggregate. It's like a bunch of berries aggregated together. Think of it that way. And then strawberries is another really wild case.
Shit,
Where-
just out strawberries.
Strawberries are different. It actually is a berry. But if you look at them, the seeds are on the outside, not the inside. And so this is very unusual for berries, but they can be on the outside.
I hear that you're
Alright.
sending. You should send it.
Okay.
I'm not gonna steal it.
Okay, let's talk a little bit about
One.
seeds. Seeds are the unit of replication for a plant, of course. So that's how the plant reproduces, but not always. You can have some plants that actually don't have sexual reproduction through seeds. Just parts of it just break off and like float down the stream. That can happen too. But here's an example of some really important ones.
All right, there's one
A
that's
lot
not
of
good.
seeds are actually pressed in these seed presses, literally, to release oils. And so
That's
that's
strawberries.
where we get a lot of these fatty oils. So sunflower oil you can get from seeds. What I'm showing you here is the castor bean plant. So this is castor oil right here. And with this plant, it's really cool. You can crush the seeds and you get castor oil. The remaining seed leftovers, don't do this at home. You can dry it and that becomes ricin, which is one of the most potent poisons on earth.
I hope.
And then and you can buy these plants in the nurseries. They're actually really good landscaping plants. There's cases where, there's
Yeah,
some
I know
guy
why
who's trying
poison.
to get ricin on his own, I don't know why, but he killed himself. So don't do that. But
Well,
up on the top there, you can see sunflower oil or safflower oil comes from a different plant. Olive oil is not really the seeds, actually, it's more the olive fruits that they're pressing. But these plants have a lot of these fatty oils that we can make use of.
question is, what's the
So
difference between
castor
olive
oil,
oil and extra
ricin, or
virgin olive oil?
Sunflower oil, olive oil, and so forth.
Just what the
Okay. The time we have left, we're going to talk a little bit about, fly through some of these plant families.
Oh, shoot, we're
Again, there's
getting
a
close.
whole bunch of different plant families, but
We're not
we're going to focus on
close.
some
We
of the
got
most important ones. And just to remind you, what we're talking about families is we're talking about the level just above the genus and species. So if we talk about, what's this, Rosa chinensis, or some kind of rose species, Rosa obviously is the genus, Rosaceae is the plant family. So that's what we're going to be talking about, not the order, class, phylum, or kingdom. Well, obviously they're all the plant kingdom we're talking about. We're just going to make it a little easier on you. These are just the plant families. And in order to remember this, some people say kings play chess on Fridays, generally speaking. I don't know, it's always different. Koalas prepare chocolate or fruit, generally speaking. Keeping precious creatures organized for grumpy scientists. You don't need to worry about that. It's just my little reminder. My daughter the other day was like, I gotta remember this stupid stuff. And I'm like, whoa, we gotta talk about this. Okay, so again, some really important things to remember is the family name usually ends in ACEAE. So the Solanaceae, the Pinaceae, the Asteraceae. So it's a Latin form, it ends in ACEAE. So, and I already mentioned this the other day about binomial nomenclature, the scientific, the Latin name. It's always used for the genus and the species. So the thing that I want you guys to remember, and you will have a test question on this. It's going to be very similar to the next slide. If it works, it's going to be a quiz question for you. Is the genus is always capitalized. The species is always lowercase. So the first word of the genus is capitalized, or the first letter of the genus is capitalized, everything else is lowercase. The name itself, the whole two-word name, is usually italicized or underlined. So that's one of these really important botanical rules. Well, any animals, not even plants, all animals. So the example is, if we're talking about a maple tree, a sugar maple, you can say, oh, it's a sugar maple, or you can say it's Aster saccharum. I've heard it pronounced two different ways. But that is in the Sapindaceae maple family. And so that's what it looks like. Like notice it's italicized. I could have underlined it here and just left it non-italicized. So that's really important. I'm making a big deal about this because some of you might continue to go on in the medical field. You might be writing papers. You'll be reading papers. You might be doing research, out in the field in nature, and you need to know this. Okay. So here's an example of my dog, Rembrandt. So you need to figure out what is the scientific name of my dog. So here's some
This kid.
Even if you don't know what the scientific name truly is, see if you can figure it out. And if you're wondering, it turns out he loves pizzelles, Italian pizzelles, so I'm holding the pizzelle and he's like, that's fine. He's a Brittany Spaniel.
So I don't think the first part is it.
Okay, so again, if you don't know, just work your way
I
through what
want
I
to
just
see
told you.
because I don't know phrases.
What one would be
Yes.
right? And keeping in mind, I always like to throw in something weird. Okay, oh, thank you. So for those of you who are
Like
logging
Canis
on your
lupus.
phones, the
I
ID is 135835. That's 135835.
Could be the underlying
Sorry,
miss.
that's probably, you couldn't see that side. So if you need that, there you go. All right.
Maybe.
Okay, again, remember for this week, points don't count. They'll start counting next week. So I still have to put Wednesday's points, well, to tell you if your method has been working, and then I'll do Wednesdays and then today's. All right, let's see what you guys have. We have the 10-second
It might be
countdown.
increase this kid. I'm changing
So
it.
again, I like to be funny,
I'm
so
scared.
don't do the.
Oh, change it quick.
All right, so yeah, so 93% of you are correct. So it is
All right.
Canis familiaris. You can also see it as, what's the other one? Canis, there's another name in there too sometimes.
I didn't know
But
that.
sticking strictly to the rules of science, that's what we have. And then a few of you said Canis lupus. Oh, that was why. So if you look it up, Canis lupus familiaris, some people say that, but this C would not be correct because it's not italicized or underlined.
Ah,
That's just an example. What we're
alrighty,
talking about.
that must be
All right.
why.
Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to be talking largely about flowering plants over here. I'm showing you this diagram just to give you a general idea that in plant world, we have plants that don't make seeds and ones that make seeds. For me, it's easier to think of the ones that make seeds. Either they're not going to have flowers, they have other means of reproduction, and that's going to be conifers or gymnosperms rather. And then flowers, or they have flowers, which are angiosperms. So examples of sunflower. If we talk, we're going to have a few examples of ones that don't have seeds. I think actually we probably don't have very much. We'll be talking about them later. But you can either have algae, ferns, mosses. Not shown on here is fungus. So we're going to be talking later on about fungus as well, mushrooms, when we talk about psychedelic plants. Sure. Oh, kiwi. In terms of the flowering plants. So kiwi should be a flowering plant, an angiosperm. Yeah, kiwi's weird though. The question is kiwi a berry?
Ooh.
I want to say yes. Yes. You cut it open. It seeds on the inside. It originates from the flower. See, I've never seen it flowering, but you have the kiwi fruits. I've seen them on the tree. So I could be wrong,
Kiwi's
but
on
I
a
would say
tree?
berry. The other thing is like a fig. Have you ever
There we
looked
go.
at a
Look
fig?
this up.
That's totally weirdly different. The fig, I think, is technically still a berry. Yeah, great question.
They do grow on trees.
All right. So you guys are thinking. It's great. All right, let's talk about a few of these before we break for the day. So we have Pinaceae, pines. So this is not only pines, fir, cedar, spruce. When we talk about Pinaceae, I want you guys to be thinking of usually trees. This is easy, think Christmas tree. The leaves, of course, are very linear to needle-like. In fact, they're called needles. And in order to reproduce, they do not have flowers. They have cones. And so this is a female cone, and this is actually a male cone. The pines are really well known for producing terpenes. These are some compounds we'll be talking about next week. But think of like sticky, if you ever get sticky on yourself from a Christmas tree, it's a pain, but it smells. And so the terpenes is responsible for those scents that you can smell, the resins that are so sticky. And so these plants are really medicinally beneficial if used in the right way and using the right plant for the right thing. Okay, ginkgos. We're still in the world of gymnosperms. Ginkgos are really cool. The ginkgo species, Ginkgo biloba, is the only known species within this family. It was thought to be extinct. I told you about how it was found in fossils. And then years ago, it was found, I think it was in Tibet, at a monastery. They actually found, I think, like 7 plants still living there. And nowadays, ginkgos are known to be really popular landscaping trees. In fact, next to the rec center, on the down part, there's a whole bunch of ginkgos that are planted in an arc. The cool thing about this is it's a dioecious tree. Dioecious means separate males and females. Most trees and plants in general are hermaphroditic, where the 2 different male and female gender roles are usually on one plant in some way. But with these, you usually have female or male ginkgos. They have these very typical fan-shaped leaves. An individual tree can live over 1,000 years, which is pretty darn amazing. The other cool thing is it's one of the very few plant species we know of that actually has sex chromosomes. Most do not. So females are XX, males are XY, just like humans. Pretty cool. The other thing is these are the female fruits. Has anyone encountered the female fruits? Okay, I'm getting some yeses and some nos. If you haven't, you wouldn't know it once you run into them. They smell like vomit. Really bad. So it turns out, though, that those fruits are actually used as a delicacy in different areas of the world. So they have to cook them and prepare them a certain way. You would not eat them raw because they are honestly totally gross. But that's how they reproduce. Okay, we had talked the other day with the Neanderthals. Remember, we talked about ephedra? So ephedra is, this is an easy one, it belongs to the Ephedraceae. It's the primary plant representing that family. Ephedra is pretty cool. So we're still in gymnosperm, so this doesn't produce flowers. So it has these many numerous branches. If you look at its reproductive structures, I mean, essentially this is what they are. Technically not flowers. It doesn't have any leaves, or they could be very minute, very small, but these plants, depending upon the species, can be packed full of ephedra. Again, it grows in these really dry areas, so it's trying to protect itself from herbivory. It probably takes a long time to grow. It's investing a lot in its own reproduction and just its growth, and if something comes along and starts eating it, it's really going to hurt hard on that plant. So another one is the Apiaceae. The Apiaceae, this is a plant known as the umbel family. So here, what I want you to think of, I'm going to put this all here, is if I get an umbrella and I put up an umbrella, and if I tear off the top part, think of all the spokes, how it comes from one central point, and then all the spokes go out. That's essentially an umbel. So any plant that you see in that way is typically in the Apiaceae. So here is Docus carota. So that carrot that is over there, that is actually the same exact species as that carrot, except this one is known as Queen Anne's lace. You see it along the freeways sometimes. Same species. The carrot, we've just modified it and adapted it and selected for that nice taproot. Queen Anne's lace, if you pull up the plant and smell the root, it has a more fibrous rooting system, but it smells actually like carrot. The leaves here are highly dissected, so they're not just simple. You can see they're just all sort of different parts to it. These plants are packed full of a whole bunch of aromatic compounds. You can smell them. We have those terpenes again, coumarins. We'll be talking about coumarins in the next few days. Essentially what they do is the coumarins are responsible in some respects for killing people. They can also cause huge rashes and irritations on the skin. So one thing that's really important is Docus carota up there is Queen Anne's lace, right? The one down below is actually poison hemlock. These grow all over around here. And in fact, I've seen like at areas, especially like around playgrounds, kids' playgrounds and stuff, you see both of the plants. And sometimes you just see a field of poison hemlock. And these are the seeds. So poison hemlock is one of the most poisonous plants around. So it's actually a neurotoxin, and it will stop your heart too. And if you just get a little bit on yourself, I had a friend once, he was lecturing and he got a bit of poison hemlock and he was trying to tell people he could smell it, it was cut, and he got it on his lips. And he started, his lips instantly went numb. And he's like, he ran out the door and went to the, the bathroom. He's putting water on his face and stuff. So it could really, it is poisonous. The difference though, if you're looking at a plant, you see these types of flowers, is you look at the stem. If you see this purple mottling, that's poison hemlock. If it's green, you probably have Queen Anne's, okay? We'll be talking about later about poisoning, about how that happens. Let's just do maybe one or two more here. And now we have sunflower. Sunflowers in the Asteraceae, the aster family. And so we already hopefully looked at, it has a compound flower with a regular
Chamomile
disc.
in there too.
Oftentimes it has a lot of those oils, and sunflower oil, when you press the seeds, can have a lot of what's known as lactones and sesquiterpenes. Cannot say that right. And we'll be talking about those on Monday and Wednesday. So chamomile is another example. This is how it grows, and we talked before the other day briefly about how you can take off the flower heads, dry them, steep them in a tea, and you can, I make my own, honestly. Okay, maybe one or two more. The Brassicaceae is our next one. The Brassicaceae used to be known as the cruciferæ once upon a time, because the petals, if you look at them, this is a great example here, the petals always are in 4 petals, and they form essentially a cross. So you got petal, petal, and then 2 more opposite. So that's why it was known as the cruciferæ, but nowadays it's named it a Brassicaceae. It does produce mustard oil glucosides, and those mustard oils are also oftentimes cytogenic. So in the Vietnam War and some of those wars, there was mustard gas that was used. Actually, World War II was the first time mustard gas was used. It might have been World War I, actually. World War I? It's banned after World War I because it was so bad. Yeah, there was Agent Orange, I'm thinking. Anyways, mustard gas comes from the mustard plant. So, but we also use it literally in our mustard. So it is used, that it's not dangerous when it's used in your mustard, but it's it gives it the yellow color that you have. And again, these are the broccoli, all those different things there are all the plants we have in the mustard family. So, last one I'll leave you with to think about is the pea family, Fabaceae. This pretty much anything that you see that has a pod is usually in the pea family. Typical flowers, you have these 2 upper flowers. We have what's known as a keel, and that's the bottom one. Oftentimes they have tendrils. This is used to be an endangered species called running buffalo clover in Ohio. And what happens is a bee, it can't self-pollinate, but a bee will come by and try to land on the bottom keel, and it flings the keel back up into the top of the flower, and so all the pollen just gets slacked over into the female part. So it actually pollinates itself that way. And I think that's all. We're going to stop there. We'll pick up on Monday with the mints, because that works perfectly. We're actually going to be smelling plants. So we're going to be talking about those mints.
Fun.
All right. So have a great weekend. I think Monday is, we have school Monday? Yay. Okay, whatever I wrote on the schedule. So we'll be picking this up on Wednesday, and I will be sleeping in on Mondays. Hopefully we will too.